Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending upon where you're tuning in from. My name's Dan Gardner, and I'd like to welcome you to this flash webinar entitled COVID-19 Supply Chain Risks and Mitigation Techniques. A little bit of background on this webinar. We as trade facilitators do quite a bit of these, but this one was a little bit different because it was actually part of a program that I was scheduled to do at TPM, the Trans-Pacific Maritime Conference here in Long Beach, which of course got postponed on Saturday. If you're not familiar with TPM, it's the largest gathering of importers and exporters in the logistics ecosystem in the United States, held every year. So for the third year running, I was going to do the educational track on Sunday, which was actually a 3-hour presentation, and the piece on COVID-19 was a part of that. So what we decided to do was carve it out specific to COVID-19, and in the spirit of keeping people updated and sharing some ideas and such, here we are. A couple of admin things to talk about. There are a lot of people on this webinar, so it's a muted mic scenario, but you can write your questions in, and we will answer them at the end. I anticipate quite a few. We should have plenty of time to go over them. And then also at the end, there'll be an email address. If you have additional questions, you're free to write those in as well, and we'll get them answered as quickly and as objectively as possible. With that said, let's get the show on the road. This is scheduled for an hour. Honestly, I don't think it's going to take that long. Content-wise, maybe 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll see question-wise. But I'll stay on as long as it takes to get people's questions answered and such. All right, let's jump right in here. As an agenda, a one-slide introduction to Trade Facilitators. That's the company that I own and operate. I'm going to be making some fairly explicit statements, and it's important you know who it is that's making these statements. We'll jump right in and get into the existing China-U.S. business model, which is to say, if we're going to try and understand the future and what the future holds in 2020, it's important that we understand the present and even the past. So we're going to look at some key characteristics of the U.S.-China business model that can be influenced or are already being influenced by COVID-19. Important to state that this is such a broad subject, given the diversity of business that goes on between the U.S. and China, be it import business, export business, air, ocean, companies importing raw materials for production here in the U.S. There's a diversity of business models there. We're going to use retail and e-commerce, omni-channel, if you'd like to call it that, as a case study, with the proviso that much, if not all, of what we're going to talk about using this as a case study is applicable to these other models. I'm quite confident in making that statement. We'll talk about 4 key characteristics of China-U.S. trade to be cognizant of as you start to plan or continue planning, I should say. If you haven't started yet, you're already in trouble in terms of dealing with the virus. Likely outcome as time progresses, and then what's an importer to do? But of course, what are other members of the ecosystem to do? Whether it's ocean carriers, airlines, 3PLs. One thing I can tell you is that well over 100 people that signed up for this event, there is a great diversity of participants, from beneficial cargo owners, BCOs, actual importers, exporters, 3PLs, customs brokers, cargo insurance people, you name it, that's on there. So it's not just what's an importer to do, what can we all do together? That's an important theme as well. I just want to check one thing before we go. Just doing a technology check here, and I'm not seeing any commentary otherwise. So I think we're in good shape, both visually and from an audio perspective. So this one slide on trade facilitators, and it's more from who is this guy and where does he get off saying all these things? And it's more of that, because we as an organization don't engage in too much self-promotion during the many, many webinars we do every year. So who are we? Well, we're LA Long Beach based, right next to the port complex, which is an image you see right here. You probably recognize on the side there. But we're a supply chain consultants and training company. I personally come from the 3PL industry, what used to be called freight forwarding and customs brokerage. Been on the BCO side. I'm a licensed customs broker for more years than I care to remember. But essentially, we do a couple different things: design, implementation, and measurement of integrated logistics programs. That's Transpac network design for actual BCOs. As a part of that, we offer advisory services for U.S. CBP and partner government agencies, trade compliance stuff. Big part of our business is consulting for digital startups that focus on logistics and supply chain, helping them convert needs in the physical world into the code that they write into their solutions. And then a big part of our business is training, old school in-class training, as well as we at TFI, this is my big claim to fame, we are by far the largest producer of online content, pre-recorded, fully animated online content for universities, trade associations, and private entities. Hundreds of hours of online content. National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association, Georgia Tech, Cal State Long Beach. We are deeply involved in this side of the business. Having said that, we can move on to why we're all here. So enough on TFI, and let's get down to business. Title slide: the potential impact of the novel coronavirus on inbound supply chains. Again, we're going to focus on inbound. That's China to the U.S. Use traditional retail and e-commerce / omni-channel as an example. But these concepts, these ideas are applicable to any business model. It's really important to point out that this webinar was actually based, yes, on the piece that I was going to do at TPM, but also on a white paper that I wrote that's getting circulated around. We'll put up an email address if you want that as well. But one of the key messages in that white paper was this is not a doomsday prediction. This is about risk management. And risk management is about identifying potential risk, threats in a supply chain, and assigning a probability of that risk happening. That is the spirit within which this presentation is made. So we're not about doomsday, we're about real day more than anything. Okay, so quick fact. The longer COVID-19, which is the other name for the coronavirus, persists, and Chinese manufacturers and their raw material suppliers remain on shutdown or limited capacity, the greater the risk to U.S. importers. It's already March. Unbelievably hard to believe under normal circumstances how quickly time flies and goes by. But as we think about the balance of the year, and we'll be talking about this in greater detail, the message from this, the overarching theme of this entire presentation is the longer the virus persists and manufacturers are either shut down completely or at limited capacity for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, the more trouble importers and exporters are going to have. That's just a simple, straight up, mathematical, apolitical fact. As an example of that and the early goings on, in our second bullet point, the China to U.S. inbound supply chain, we all know this. This isn't predicting the future. This is already going on, is already showing signs of stress. Meaning, some quick examples, that manufacturers, the vendors that actually make stuff for U.S. importers, they're having difficulties getting raw materials from their tier one vendors who are having trouble getting raw materials from their tier one vendors, tier one, tier two, tier three. That's already surfacing. It's not anecdotal. It's a trend that's going on. We already know that steamship lines are blanking their sailings, which means that justifiably they're removing ships from sailings and artificially manipulating supply. That's what they should be doing. So no knock on them there, but that creates its own challenges that we'll talk about in just a little bit. And we also already know, classic case of unintended consequences, is that air cargo rates are already skyrocketing. And that the main reason for that is that all of these passenger flights that get taken out of, let's use Hong Kong to LA, Hong Kong to Chicago, Hong Kong to Atlanta, as well as other places, Shanghai and such, passenger flights have been canceled. Everybody knows that freight forwarders have agreements with passenger airlines for cargo as well. So the removal of that passenger capacity, by virtue of its very removal, took out the cargo capacity as well. And in speaking with some of my contacts and people who know a lot more about this than I do, we won't get into rates right now, but I can tell you for certain that pre-coronavirus, let's say before CNY, Chinese New Year, the rates now are 3 to 4 times higher. And I'm talking air freight Hong Kong to LA as a bellwether. That's not going to change even as passenger flights return. We'll talk more about that in just a bit as well. So here's the deal. U.S. importers, as well as the entire supply chain ecosystem, everybody that's on this webinar, the customs brokers, the drayage people, CFS operators, 3PLs, carriers, on and on and on, we're all at risk. So the first piece of advice is that every company that's engaged in trade with China, import or export, has to be in full risk management mode. And we're going to define what that means, as well as a dozen or so, even more things that companies can do as part of that risk management undertaking. But as I mentioned previously at the top end of the conversation, risk management, and we all should be engaging in this, is the identification of risks, what can go wrong or what has already go wrong and even get worse, assign probabilities to the likelihood of those things happening. What's the likelihood that air freight rates are going to continue to get higher? Very high. And probability is assigned from 0 to 1.0. Not expressed as a percentage, but as a decimal. So probability of air freight rates going higher, I'd have to go with a 0.9 on that. That's just one example, but that's what you need to be doing. And of course, what's your plan? In the event that some or all, unfortunately, of these things take place, we have to have that risk management mentality. Let me double check something here. Okay, we're good. I am a firm believer that in order to influence or at least anticipate future occurrences, you have to understand the past and the present. So that white paper that I spoke of a moment ago really started out with saying there are 4 things that are inherent to Chinese supply chains now that we have to be cognizant of as we plan for the future. That's what we're going to talk about here. In order to identify those types of risks, along with their probability of occurrence and the ability to formulate mitigation plans, importers need to understand 4 key factors. We're going to go into each of them in detail. This is a summary slide. First of all, build-to-order production models. A quick spoiler alert, what we mean by that is that vendors overseas, vendors in China, manufacturers, they don't carry in finished goods inventory. They build to order, meaning when they receive a purchase order from a U.S. importer. That has very particular implications for our discussion today. Second bullet, the concept of cumulative lead times. I said earlier as well that this whole exercise in terms of risk and increasing amounts of risk, it's about timing as the year unfolds. And the importance, and again, we're going to define these in detail in just a sec. So if you're not familiar with these terms, don't worry about it, but get familiar with them because they are essential to everything that's going to take place in 2020. The importance of lead time offsetting, the timing of Chinese New Year. There's never a good time for a tragedy and loss of life that COVID-19 has brought. But the acceleration of COVID-19 right around Chinese New Year, goodness, the timing couldn't have been any worse. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about China's migrant workforce. So the stage is set. Let's get into these 4 key factors. First off, with some noted exceptions, the heavy-duty players, the Walmarts of the world, perhaps the Apples and others, the rest of the supply chain community, the import community in the United States, deals with manufacturers that operate under a build-to-order production model. They do not carry finished goods inventory. That's a fact. I've been in dozens of factories in China and throughout Asia, for that matter, top to bottom, from Beijing down to Shenzhen. And the vast majority, if not all of them, operate on a B2O, build-to-order basis. What does that mean? To summarize, there is no finished goods inventory. And these vendors, these suppliers, only go out and procure raw materials and go into production upon receiving a PO, purchase order, from you, the importer, and a corresponding down payment. Not unusual at all for a vendor in China to say, Mr. or Ms. Importer in the US, you issue a PO, you send me 30% up front. When the bill of lading gets issued, you send me another 30, and then you pay the rest when the freight shows up in the United States. That is very, very commonplace. As you might imagine, because there is no safety stock, there is no buffer inventory of raw materials for that matter, that the tightness within which things have to happen. A PO is placed, that PO is accepted by the vendor, they go out and get raw materials, production, book 3 40-foot containers, off the freight goes. It's all very tight. That has, as I said, very particular implications that we'll talk about in a minute. Because the vast majority of importers operate in a B2O build-to-order production model, the success of that model depends upon this concept known as cumulative lead time. This is not a term that I made up. Anybody that, for example, has done a certification with APIX, I know they changed their name, but it used to be the American Production and Inventory Control Society, which I think the world of. I did that APIX certification many, many years ago. This is an actual term. This is not made up. So cumulative lead time for every product that a U.S. importer sources, not just in China, but anywhere overseas, knowledge of what that cumulative lead time is super critical when operating in a B2O build-to-order environment. What does cumulative lead time mean? Well, for purposes of our conversation, think of it this way. We as an importer, cumulative lead time is the amount of days that go by from the moment a purchase order is placed on a vendor in China, for purposes of our conversation, until those goods are received in the U.S. at their point of distribution. Maybe at a DC in Savannah, maybe at a fulfillment center in Chicago for e-commerce business. Depends on your model, but cumulative lead time is that. So everything that goes on with the amount of days that transpire while those individual activities go on makes up cumulative lead time. We place a purchase order as an importer. It takes 3 days for the vendor under normal conditions to come back and say, yeah, I can make that in the time that you want it. Production lead time, 90 days, 120 days, depends. Shipping, 14 days from Yantian to Long Beach. Throw in a couple days at the port of arrival, especially if it's a 20,000 TEU ship, you might need 3 to 4 days for it to get offloaded. If you didn't do your customs clearance 5 days out, shame on you to begin with, but add a couple more days onto that. Using LA, Long Beach, or larger ports as an example, you have to get an appointment to go pick up your freight. Now, that's not a big deal now because there isn't any freight, but under normal conditions, that could take through 2 or 3 days just to get an appointment. Drayage. Is it an IPI move? The list goes on and on and on. The point is that long before COVID-19 showed up, savvy importers know the cumulative lead time for every product that they source overseas. They add up all of the days for the various activities that I just outlined, and that's their CLT. And that is tied into when they place purchase orders on vendors. Let's talk more about that. For brick and mortar retailers, as well as e-commerce merchants, this idea of item-specific cumulative lead times are aligned with the in-house dates throughout the year, but especially key events on the U.S. retail calendar. And there is such a thing as a U.S. retail calendar. That's not a made-up term either. In-house dates, as the name would indicate, is the date that goods are needed in a DC in Savannah, in a fulfillment house in Chicago. What are the key dates on the retail calendar? And this is where things start to get sticky from a timing perspective. Back to school, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and Christmas. So what happens under normal conditions? Based on an item-specific cumulative lead time and the required in-house dates, U.S. importers place the purchase orders on their vendors through another technique, this is a real term, called lead time offsetting. fairly easy concept to understand, and we'll use something relatable for everybody online. If you know that you have to be to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and for you to get up, shower, get dressed, iron a shirt or a skirt or whatever it is you do, and get out the door and get to work on time, you have to get up at 7:15 to do that. Now, if you live in LA, that would be physically impossible. It would be more like 6:30 to get to work at 8. That is what lead time offsetting is. So think of it this way. If a U.S. retailer wants to have, let's say, the example I used in the white paper was a jeans importer working with a vendor in Guangzhou, that the cumulative lead time was 90 days from the moment they place a purchase order till they get the stuff in their DC out in Santa Fe Springs here in California. Well, if they want to have the goods in-house by July 15th, they have to place the PO by April 15th. That is lead time offsetting, and that takes us to the crux of the problem. The longer the virus lingers and production is at less than full capacity, or maybe even on shutdown, the greater the probability that CLTs are compromised. What does that mean? Well, if your vendor says to you, oh, that PO that you placed in March, I can't get to it until June, and there's a 120-day cumulative lead time, and you need that stuff for back to school, you're toast. That's what that means. That's the essence of the challenge. And again, while we're speaking specifically to retailing and e-commerce and omnichannel and such, the same principle applies. Even if you're importing raw materials to go into production, the same principle applies. So what does all this mean? U.S. importers, you simply run out of time to make key in-house dates on the retail calendar. What's the normal reaction when production schedules go off or a PO didn't get placed in time? Sometimes you have to convert to air freight. We already know that air freight is through the roof and will continue to be through the roof. So we have some issues there. Let's move on. Number 3, the timing of COVID-19's acceleration during CNY has contributed to a backlog of purchase orders, that should be plural, purchase orders, and master production schedules. Everybody knows that's involved in this trade. CNY happens in late January, early Feb. Factories close down, sometimes up to 2 weeks. So all your outstanding POs have to be squared away and shipped, no work in process inventory. But companies continue to place POs to meet what? The retail calendar or whatever their needs have to be. So with a shutdown or lower capacity, exacerbated by the fact that the government extended CNY and some companies have been slow to return, there's the backlog, both from a purchase order and master production schedule. And MPS, as the name would indicate, is what the vendor uses to schedule all the production that they're going to do for the various customers that they deal with around the world, not just you as an importer. So this lull, the bad timing of CNY, contributes already to longer cumulative lead times. So the trouble has already started. Last point here. Historically, and this is just a demographic fact, there's no speculation here at all, is that China's manufacturing workforce has been made up of migrant workers. And that just means domestic migrant workers, folks from other areas in China that live in factory dormitories. I have been in these dormitories in South China, up north to Shanghai. This is the business model. People come from other cities, other provinces to live and work in these dormitories. There were already challenges with that because the Chinese export miracle has been going on since 1980. Literally, that's another historical fact, not to be disputed. So over time, over the period of 40 years and before the virus, China's workforce has been opting for jobs that are closer to home. Can you really blame them as opposed to living in a factory dormitory? So there was already a labor shortage in coastal China. So you add to that, by government mandate or of their own volition, workers have been slow to return to their post after CNY. So you have a timing issue, you have a manufacturing capacity issue, and you have a labor issue. Let me see, I'm just double checking something here, but I just want to make sure. Someone's taking notes but falling behind. Will we share the presentation? Yes, absolutely. No problem at all. All right. So these are the four issues. Now here's the likely outcomes. And I said this wasn't a doomsday presentation, but it's certainly sounding to start like it. Trying to be as objective as possible, but dealing with the reality of the situation. So what are some of the likely outcomes? Let's run through this storyline. As of right now, we said this a moment ago, U.S. importers continue to send POs to their vendors per their retail calendar requirements. POs being placed on vendors are a throughout the year program. Now they'll accelerate in anticipation again of back to school and Black Friday, et cetera, but these POs are being sent. And what I'm hearing, I'm honestly having a hard time believing this, that people would be this crazy. But when people go into panic mode and the herd mentality takes over, it's called a feedback loop that actually makes matters worse. The mantra now is buy early and buy often. What does that mean? That U.S. importers, again, this is purely speculative. I've only heard this, so take it with a grain of salt, please. But some importers, if they need 100 of an item, they're ordering 500, hoping that they'll get 100 into the production schedule. Clearly, when everybody's doing that, because that's not an original idea, that just makes matters worse. It's going to exacerbate the situation. Due to previously mentioned factors, as well as a few others that'll come up in a moment, this backlog of purchase orders has begun to accumulate because there's no release valve in the form of goods being manufactured, at least at full capacity. So what happens there? Buy early, buy often. Import. This I know for a fact because I have talked to people about this. Importers are now sending POs ahead of the retail calendar. So they know, let's go to our jean people that wanted the jeans in the DC by July 15th. They would have had to place the order April 15th. They're placing it now, which once again creates this feedback loop that makes matters worse. You need to be thinking about that. Third bullet, the inability of producers, those Chinese manufacturers, to keep up with manufacturing demand because there's just more demand than there is capacity when things come back online. It's creating a logjam. You may have seen this on the news. This is not a Dan Gardner original term here, as a V-shaped recovery, meaning things go off the cliff starting around CNY, and hopefully as the virus dissipates and things start to get back to normal, it's going to spike right back up, which is likely to overwhelm the logistics infrastructure. So that's part of the planning we have to consider also. As such, last bullet, there are several risks or threats that are likely to arise as a result of these dynamics. Here's where it starts to get interesting. Think about this. Raw materials are hard to come by. Demand is greater than supply. Increases in raw material costs could compel suppliers to ask for price increases across the board, saying, yes, I can make you 1,000 pair of jeans, but they're no longer X dollars a pair, they're Y dollars a pair, and of course Y is greater than X. Being a quasi-cynic, I've been in global trade for too long, I think about this, and I think about how Chinese manufacturers had to take part of the hit, meaning lower their unit prices to U.S. importers to cover the Trump tariffs, which, as we all know, are paid for by the importer, by the way. But could U.S. manufacturers view this as Chinese manufacturers view this as a clawback opportunity, as payback for price cuts to offset the Trump tariffs? I have no proof of this, but I do know how people think. And the possibility of that is quite real. Here's another one. Manufacturers begin to prioritize the POs that they receive from their many customers overseas. And they prioritize those POs and production runs, their master production schedule, as it's called, based on who's willing to pay the most. This will come up later in the presentation, but I call it the fast pass effect. I used to live in South Florida and live in Southern California, so I've been to Disney World and Disneyland many times. And anyone that's been there knows that a fast pass is you pay outrageous money to get into the park, and if you actually want to go on a ride anytime soon, you can buy and pay extra for a fast pass that lets you cut everybody in line. That's what we're talking about here. Very real, going on as we speak. Another third bullet is that suppliers, this goes on all the time anyway, suppliers may accept only partial PO quantities. I can't make 1,000 pair of jeans for you in the time you want it. I can make 500. That goes on, as I said, under normal circumstances. The other thing is vendors can just say, no, I can't take your purchase order. Just because a U.S. importer places a PO on a vendor doesn't mean they have to accept it. Under normal conditions, 99% probability or 0.99% probability that that PO will get accepted. No guarantees here. Last bullet before we move on. As production comes back online, seeing this already, Chinese factories will start to make more ocean container bookings than they need in an effort to assure space. This is the buy early, buy often principle. I'm going to need 5 containers in 2 weeks. I'm a Chinese manufacturer speaking to myself now. I know that things are ramping back up. I'm going to book for 5 when I really only need 2. The famous no-show booking, which throws the planning for the container lines, the steamship lines, and their corresponding container yards into a tizzy. That goes on in regular peak season circumstances. I think it will be even more intense this year. Maybe not now, but moving ahead, definitely. You're probably starting to see a trickle effect down into the physical supply chain. That's intentional because the things that we're talking about, the examples that we're providing, really move down that supply chain. Naturally, when that V shape starts to recover, factories come online, they can get raw materials, etc. Drayage services at origin could be compromised. Equipment requirements, both the tractor, the actual power unit, the ability to get containers, have drivers return to work. Have they been allowed to return to work? Because some of drayage people are migrant workers as well. So don't make assumptions about the ability, oh, everything's good, we're back to production, everything will be golden. It's not going to be like that. These are the things that you have to be measuring and paying attention to. If, conversely, the V shape continues downward, steamship lines might blank more sailings or even lay up a vessel. If you've not heard that term, a blank sailing is just that. It's like a canceled flight, essentially, for an airline. A laid up vessel, they come out of circulation completely. That's a different ballgame. Have to pay attention to that as well. On the recovery trend upward, that trickle down theory, origin CFS, that's a container freight station, container yard, and terminal operations could be swamped. I was just this morning, again, I live and work in the LA Long Beach basin here, was out seeing a client who's in the logistics space, who's part of this trickle down effect, albeit on the U.S. side of things. And they strip containers and do that type of thing. And quiet as a church mouse, as the saying goes back in Massachusetts, my home state. Well, that's going to change. So think about this for a second. If let's just use a 3PL as an example. In a CFS, things are quiet. Not unusual to see that type of operation use 50%, even more, temp labor. So you cut your temp labor, which you should do because it's the reality of the situation. But things start ramping up again, and you're not going to get the same temp labor back. And the term temp labor is somewhat of a misnomer because a temp could be 6 months, a year at a place and really gain some skills and understand how things get done and be very productive. So justifiably, a company reduces its force, the temp labor force, things ramp back up in a month or two, and now what? Because you're not going to get the same people back. That's just another thing to be thinking about. Here's one that's really important and would have been a most salient subject for TPM because that's the unofficial time when companies, importers and carriers and exporters negotiate their rates. During ocean contract season, which is right now, carriers and the NVOCCs, the non-vessel operating common carriers, could take advantage of existing uncertainty to at least try to raise rates for the 2021 contract period, which is typically from May to May. not so much of a prediction of the future, because anyone that was involved in this last year and the year before, which I was, when the Trump tariffs came in and the uncertainty around Trump tariffs kind of threw things into a bit of a tizzy, the steamship lines were able, not huge increases, but certainly bigger from 18 to 19, for sure. Question becomes, is that going to happen based on different type of uncertainty, but uncertainty nonetheless? And my guess is the answer to that question is yes. So you have to have, you as the importer, and a carrier too, have to have a specific strategy about how you're going to deal with these things. You know, it's nothing funny about this, but it's kind of ironic that the biggest subject around TPM before coronavirus hit was the IMO low sulfur surcharge, and was it going to be $100 a container or 150 or 200? I haven't heard a peep about low sulfur. That has to be part of your strategy as well. All of it does. Okay, some other likely outcomes. We're going to get to what can we do about this stuff in just a minute, and we'll answer questions as well. As production output increases, producers come back online in China, and demand for space on ships surges. Carriers will start to roll containers. If you're not familiar with that term, not just like, but somewhat similar to when a manufacturer makes 5 bookings when they only need 2. I should say a booking for 5 containers when they only need 2. Well, the 2 can play at that game, and the steamship lines will overbook a ship, get the containers into their container yard in the anticipation of no-show bookings. But if there's more containers than there are space on the ship, they have to wait. That's called rolling a container. That happens under normal conditions. So if you think about it somewhat cynically, that'd be a good problem to have. But it's not too pleasant when you're already late and you get rolled for another week. Moving down our supply chain, that trickle-down effect. The destination ocean terminals, I already said this. Container yards and CFSs, container freight stations, could be overwhelmed with a spike in freight. Think about LA Long Beach. I don't want to pick on LA Long Beach, but this is where I live and work, and it's a good example. When things are cranking at the port, it takes a while to offload a ship. You can't get an appointment to pick up a container until that container is available. Even if you have an appointment, you can get turned away. There are 12, if not 13, container terminals at LA Long Beach, all with different schedules and different rules. Today we're only taking empties. Tomorrow we're not taking empties. All of that, under normal circumstances, can be a pain in the behind. It actually can't. It's not that it can be a pain in the behind. It is a pain in the behind. So imagine what that's going to be like when things start to spike back up. Air freight rates from China continue to skyrocket, and they will continue even more, even as passenger airlines return to normal flight schedules. I mentioned air freight rates per kilo are 3 times what they were a month ago. I'm hearing numbers, and again, we won't throw numbers around. We don't want to disrupt the market. But charter rates, you want to charter a 747 from Hong Kong to LAX, bring several checkbooks, because that's 3 times, if not 4 times higher as well. And then on the domestic side, and we do have some domestic carriers online today, these delays on the international side of cumulative lead time force U.S. importers to make up for lost time and expedite the domestic transportation component of their logistics chains, meaning I go from rail to full truckload. I go from regular full truckload to team drivers. I pay for expedited service on less than truckload. And then in really dire circumstances, I'll use domestic air freight, which, taken cumulatively, all these extra expenses drive up our landed cost as the importer, which may in turn exceed the actual sales price of the goods that we want to sell. That's a whole other story, but there's a possibility of that happening as well. All right. Okay. What's an importer to do? Because, I was writing this white paper and had some pretty decent ideas on how things could go off the rails, but I hadn't thought about, well, what can you do about it? And honestly, within the spirit of trying to be helpful, because this white paper was made available to the general public and continues to be disseminated, et cetera. What good is a white paper that just essentially complains about things without offering some potential solution? So I took the extra couple days to think it out and talk to some people whose opinions I respect and come up with a list of stuff that maybe, emphasis on maybe, an importer and their trade partners can engage in. So let's run through that and we can start to wrap things up. Well, the first one is, and I get a real kick out of this, I saw somebody on CNN, a subject matter expert, a pundit, talking about these things. Move sourcing to another country. Well, yeah, good luck with that, because this subject came up during the Trump tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs. And anyone that's done this knows that it's a lot easier said than done in terms of try to find a vendor anywhere in Mexico, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, all the usual suspects whose names come up, to find a vendor that has the quality that you need, that has access to the raw materials that they need, can come up with the unit price, production capacity, on and on and on. Under regular circumstances, that's a 2 to 3 year endeavor. So here's the bottom line. Unless you had a China plus one, meaning China vendor plus a vendor somewhere else, or a China plus N, meaning multiple vendors, if that's not in place already, you're stuck with what you have. It's just that simple. So caution there. Second bullet, and this is more of a corporate culture component of things. If you're not already, you have to treat the coronavirus as an exercise in risk management and mitigation, meaning that everybody in the company, starting at the very top, recognizes it for what it is, a time-phased increase in risk, basically, meaning the more the time goes by without resolution, the greater the probability of these risks coming to fruition. You have to be thinking like that, starting from the very top. And from there, if you haven't already, and I hope that you have, and maybe this is redundant, but that's a good thing. It's validation for what you're already doing. You have to form, and this applies to importers, 3PLs, carriers, everybody. Form a supply chain risk mitigation project team. Not just logistics people, not just shipping people, but made up of sourcing, purchasing, logistics, financial, IT, and C-level members. You have to have a project team. Call it risk mitigation team. What does that team need to do? First suggestion, and this is some terminology that might be a little obscure, but really important. It's called S&OP, and that stands for Sales and Operations Planning. And these are activities that companies engage in on an ongoing basis. And what we're saying here is if you as an importer, and we'll define S&OP in just 1 second, but if you as an importer engage in S&OP now, you're a step ahead of the game. Take some of the tactics that you use in S&OP and apply it to your risk mitigation. Why is that? Well, here's what sales and operations planning is. Every company, we're talking about importers now, their tactical supply chain execution for the period of 1 year starts with a forecast. That forecast has to be converted into purchase orders to be placed on vendors over time throughout the retail calendar. As the year starts to unfold, Jan and Feb already in the books, sales and operations planning requires this multifunctional team, same people as the team we spoke of a moment ago, to sit down every month and say, here's what we predicted was going to happen, what we forecasted to happen on an item-specific basis, and here's what really happened. We said we were going to sell 1,000 pairs of jeans, and we only sold 500. Well, if you leave your forecast the way it is throughout the year, you're going to have big-time problems. So sales and operations planning demands that upon making a comparison between what was forecasted and what really happened, determination of a variance in forecasting essentially, that you have to make adjustments. We're selling more than we thought. Let's buy more. We're not selling as much as we thought. Let's back off. Things are going well. Let's leave things alone. That's what S&OP is. So if companies are doing that now, accelerate it even more, borrow that methodology from sales and operations planning and apply it to your risk mitigation methodology. In fact, you can make the argument that the same people that are on the S&OP team should be on the risk mitigation team. Second bullet here, review all outstanding as well as pending purchase orders to be issued in the next 90 days on a rolling basis. Admittedly, this is a manual exercise, and companies might have literally thousands of POs out there. That's a tall order. But if you're crossing your fingers and hoping for the best, crossing your fingers is not a strategy. So you have to get this team together on a PO level, item-specific level, by vendor, product family, and category, and a daily huddle on PO-specific issues. That jeans guy in Guangzhou is telling us no way on the 1,000. What do we do now? That's part of that daily huddle risk mitigation team. You have to do that. The other thing you have to do, assuming that you have an ERP or other systems, because lots of companies still use email and Google Docs and Excel spreadsheets, but if you have an enterprise resource planning system or other systems like material requirements planning, you have to update the system. Because the good news is everything we talked about before, calculation of cumulative lead time offsetting, all of that is built into the algorithms found, at least in the purchasing component of an ERP or a material requirements planning system. But it's the classic garbage in, garbage out. So if you're making new determinations that the cumulative lead time on our jeans coming out of Guangzhou is no longer 90 days, it's 150, and you don't change that in your system or update your spreadsheet, you're doomed, because it's never going to work out. You have to make those updates. What else can an importer do? Engage your product vendors on a daily basis. Again, recognizing big importers could have 200, 300, 400 vendors around the world, maybe a couple of hundred of them in China. While recognizing that, this is what needs to get done. Point number one, pay close attention to their financial health. There's a reason why vendors ask for a down payment up front when a purchase order is placed, and then they want another 30% when the goods ship. These aren't liquid-rich companies. They don't have a lot of cash laying around. So the risk for a vendor going under is real. How do you pay close attention is an easy thing to say. How do you make those determinations? That's a harder one, admittedly. Get updates on their operations, and to the extent that you can, because the herd mentality takes over quickly here, is to you as the importer to instruct your vendors and your 3PLs for that matter at origin. If they're going to make container bookings earlier, usually it's 14 days out. That's kind of the industry standard. So if I need a container for an order I'm producing for an importer in Atlanta, I'll order that container. I'll make a booking just like I do for a hotel with 14 days in advance. Extend it out to 3. That's permissible. That's common practice during a peak season. You go beyond that, you'll find yourself at the point where the steamship line is going to say, whether you call them on the phone or it's an online booking, we're not taking bookings 4 weeks out, 5 weeks out. So 3 weeks might be a good standard to use. Here's the other one. Don't just engage with your vendors. Have your 3PLs, your freight forwarders at origin, your ocean carriers that you have direct contracts with, your non-vessel operating common carriers, your customs brokers, make them a part of the process. Make sure that your 3PL, your forwarder at origin, is talking to your factories every day. A, they need to coordinate in the first place, and B, 3PLs are a great source of market intelligence. Make use of that information proactively, as we say here. On the negotiation side, have an explicit strategy for how you will negotiate carrier and or NVOCC contracts, and that's base rates, ports of loading, ports of discharge. How are you going to deal with IMO 2020? Because that's not going away. Let's not forget about that. And maybe explicit clauses on rolled containers or no-show bookings. But it can't be business as usual this year for ocean contract negotiation, whether it's with a carrier and or NVOCC. You have to be much more explicit, much more focused on what this year is going to look like. Almost finished. What else? LA Long Beach is going to love me for this, but explore alternative ports of discharge in the U.S. You could say the same thing at origin for that matter. If you're importing out of South China, you have Yantian, you can still use Hong Kong, Dashan Bay. How about the port of Nansha as well? So look at different ports of loading, different ports of discharge, and get those port pairs into your agreements with your carriers and NVOs. Because it's likely, although the rates might be higher, that you can get common rated rates, which is to say the rate out of Yantian and Nansha, if it's the same carrier or the same NVO, is the same. Common rating, something to think about as well. Devise a plan for using air freight services because that day will come. And even if it's just working or talking to air freight forwarders well ahead of time and making your intentions known, that's an important first step, because if the first call you have with an air freight forwarder is on a Friday afternoon, when you need freight to move over the weekend, when it's already Saturday in China, you're in trouble. And then finally, budget funds in advance for these additional costs, what we referred to earlier as the fast pass effect. Unfortunately, and I don't want to sound cynical because that's not the intent, but it might come down to the only way out of this situation is to buy your way out. And that's increase in unit costs, cutting people in line for production runs, and 3PL services too. The fast pass, anyone who's been to Disney knows what that's all about. Pay huge money to get into the park, and to avoid waiting 3 hours to see Nemo, you can pay another $150 so you can cut everybody. It's the exact same thing. And that's an unfortunate reality, but something you have to plan for and budget for. And if those expenses don't materialize or it's less than what you thought, just reverse the accrual later. All right, that's the end. I said 11:45. That's not too bad. It's 11:51. But if you'd like a copy, no obligation copy of this white paper, I called it the Coronavirus China's Standing 8 Count. That's a boxing term. You can read about what it means in the paper. Just write to this email address here. We'll gladly send you a PDF copy. If you have any questions after the fact, write to this email as well. I'm going to run through. I know it was fast, but we had to get through it. And if you want a copy of the presentation, PDF version, just write and we'll gladly send it to you. This is about sharing information that might help you. So we're happy to do that. Let's see. I'm taking notes, but falling behind. Okay, so no questions. People are probably in a state of shock after that rather grim portrayal of reality, because in risk management, you have to be thinking about best case, worst case, most likely case. And the first step is identifying threats. Whether you're an importer, an exporter, a 3PL, a customs broker, you have to engage in your own risk management. And if you are a company that offers services to an importer or an exporter, you have to help them with theirs. This is an opportunity to create additional value to your customers, because I think things are going to get a little bit hairy. Hold on a second. I think I saw. Oops. Just want to double check something. Just a second, please. I think that's it. So we might do this again or do actual updates, in a week or two, depending on what's going on. So if you're on the email blast, you'll see that. If you're on LinkedIn, you'll see that, and maybe get forwarded things from colleagues and such. But that is the official conclusion of today's presentation. This is serious business, and it's all about risk management now. So we have to engage together as an ecosystem to identify risk and mitigate that risk. I think as time goes by, especially in that retail space, omni-channel, e-commerce fulfillment, when cumulative lead times exceed the retail calendar, back to school, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas time, that's when the trouble will really start. So you have to be, I'm sure you are, but you need to be thinking about this stuff now. So I will say thank you. I wish you good luck. Certainly stay safe, stay healthy. And if there's anything that we can do with trade facilitators to help you, we're more than happy to do so, starting with sharing a copy of the presentation and or a copy of that white paper. So with that, thank you. Good luck and stay safe.